All right, good afternoon. Bear with me. Since we had a celebration of hard labor on Monday, we have quite a bit of stuff to catch up on. The Secretary General was in Beijing over the weekend, where he spoke at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. He said that China and Africa can unite their combined potential for peaceful, durable, equitable progress, and that the Forum embodies two major priorities of the United Nations: to pursue a fair globalization and to promote development that leaves no one behind. He also stressed the stronger cooperation between China and Africa should lead to sustainable, environmentally friendly, and resilient development in Africa, reaching first those people that are furthest behind. The Secretary General added that we need to work together to guarantee the financial sustainability of African development. He also warned that a sustainable future for Africa needs to take into account climate change, and he called on China to share the advances with Africa to enable the continent to leapfrog traditional polluting development in favor of green growth. You can find his full remarks online. And during the visit in Beijing, the Secretary General met with President Xi Jinping, with whom he discussed the importance of multilateralism, climate action, and China's support for development on the African continent. He also met with the Foreign Minister of China and the Presidents of Côte d'Ivoire, Angola, and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission. And the Secretary General landed back in New York a few hours ago. And in a statement we issued yesterday, you will see the Secretary General noted with concern the conviction and sentencing in Myanmar of journalists Wallon and Kyaw So-u to 7 years of imprisonment. He urged the authorities to review this decision. The Secretary General stressed that the right to freedom of expression and information is a cornerstone of any democracy. It is unacceptable that these journalists were prosecuted for reporting on major human rights violations against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. The Secretary General will continue to advocate for the release of the journalists. He calls for full support of freedom of the press and all human rights in Myanmar. Meanwhile, the new High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, also urged the immediate and unconditional release of the journalists. She said that their coverage of the Indian massacre by the military, for which military subsequently admitted responsibility, was clearly in the public interest and may otherwise never have come to light. Ms. Bachelet said their conviction follows a legal process that clearly breached international standards and sends a message to all journalists in Myanmar that they cannot operate fearlessly, but they must make a choice between self-censor and risk protection. And September 1st was the first day in office for the new High Commissioner, Ms. Bachelet. She assumed her function succeeding Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. Ms. Bachelet will be sworn in by the Secretary General tomorrow morning at a ceremony here on the 38th floor, and press coverage for that event will be announced later this afternoon. Turning to Syria, today our humanitarian colleagues have received reports from various sources that multiple airstrikes reportedly hit a number of areas in western rural Idlib and northern rural Hama in Syria, causing the death and injury of several people and damages to civilian infrastructure, including schools and a market. The United Nations reiterates its deep concern about the humanitarian situation in Idlib and about the potentially catastrophic humanitarian consequences of further military escalation in the area. Close to 3 million people are estimated to be the Idlib de-escalation zone. The UN and its humanitarian partners continue to respond to needs in Idlib and across the northwest of Syria, drawing on cross-border assistance deliveries from Turkey, which provides a critical lifeline for hundreds of thousands of civilians who cannot be reached through other means. More funding is urgently needed to respond to the potential military escalation in the northwest of the country. The UN and humanitarian partners estimate the cost of responding to further escalation in the northwest to $311 million. Meanwhile, the special envoy for Syria, Stephane de Mistura, was in Geneva today, and he spoke to reporters to say that he expects to meet in Geneva on the 10th and 11th of September with senior officials from Russia, Turkey, and Iran in talks which build on earlier consultations this summer in Geneva and in Sochi. He said the talks over the coming days will be an important moment of truth. His remarks are online, and the video should be up on the webcast. And he also spoke after that with Jan Egeland on the humanitarian situation, and the transcript shall be ready shortly, but the video should already be up. And meanwhile, on South Sudan, our colleagues at the UN peacekeeping mission there report that almost 3,500 internally displaced people have been successfully relocated from the UN Protection of Civilians site in Juba to a new site within the community in a joint effort between the UN mission and our humanitarian partners. This is the first movement of displaced people of this magnitude out of the UN Juba protection site. Separately, UNHCR and UN refugee aid, UNHCR announced today that it is bringing South Sudan refugee representatives face-to-face with the parties involved in key negotiations in Khartoum. This dialogue will help ensure that refugees continue to play a pivotal role in the revitalized peace effort to end the country's devastating civil war. And that's more information is available online. Also in South Sudan, the Special Representative for Children Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, will be conducting her first ever mission to South Sudan between the 4th and 8th of September. Her work on the ground aims to take stock at the progress and challenges in the implementation of the action plan to end and prevent grave violations against children. She will also encourage on pending commitments and identify opportunities for parties to strengthen the protection of children, including reintegration efforts. And today in Berlin, a two-day conference on Africa's Lake Chad region concluded with the participation of more than 70 countries, international organizations, and civil society groups. And donors announced $2.17 billion to support activities in Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. The emergency relief coordinator, Mark Lowcock, said that more than 10 million people in Lake Chad region will still need life-saving humanitarian aid and protection. Violence, hunger, displacement, and fear remain the harsh realities of their daily lives. But today, he said, we have better access to many communities that we had a year ago. Mr. Lowcock thanked the donors for their profoundly generous announcements of support for our humanitarian operations. And you will see in a statement we issued over the weekend, the Secretary General condemned the continued escalation of violence in and around Libya's capital, in particular the use by armed groups of indiscriminate shelling, leading to the death and injury of civilians, including children. He reminded all parties that indiscriminate use of force is a violation of international humanitarian human rights law, and urged all parties to grant humanitarian relief for those in need, particularly those who are trapped by the fighting. For its part, UNHCR and the UN Human Rights Office also appealed to the parties to spare civilians and civilian infrastructure. And the UN Human Rights Office said that since the outbreak of violence in Tripoli on 26th of August, at least 21 civilians have been killed, including 2 women and 2 children, with a further 16 injured. The UN Human Rights Office emphasizes the need for the facilitation, immediate and unimpeded, safe access to humanitarian aid for all those who need it. And yesterday, the Secretary General welcomed the recommendation by consensus of a set of possible guiding principles on emerging technologies in the areas of lethal autonomous weapon systems by the group of government experts within the Convention of Certain Conventional Weapons. He's particularly encouraged by the recommendations for the high contracting parties to continue the work of the group in 2019. The Secretary General hopes the high contracting parties can build upon this achievement. In this connection, he recalls his commitment as articulated in his agenda for disarmament to support efforts of member states to elaborate new measures to ensure that humans remains at all times in control of the use of force. And last Friday, late evening, we announced the Secretary General appointment of Janine Hennis-Plasschaert of the Netherlands as his new special representative for Iraq and head of the UN mission in Iraq. She will succeed, of course, as you know, Jan Kubiš, to whom the Secretary General is grateful for his service. Ms. Hennis-Plasschaert has served as Minister of Defense of the Netherlands, becoming the first woman to be appointed in that role. She also served as a member of the House of Representatives of the Netherlands and a member of the European Parliament. And I will just leave you with the reminder that at 3 p.m. in this very room, the President of the Security Council for the month of September, Ambassador Nikki Haley of the United States, will be briefing you on the program of work. I now work. Yes, Masood.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephane. Two questions. One is about this final the United States has cut off all aid to any Palestinian bodies support. Is there any contingency plan that the Secretary has planned to appeal to the member states to compensate for the loss that is being incurred by the UN agencies?
Well, as you know, UNRWA, which is the main actor in terms of humanitarian aid in that area, has been facing a financial shortfall for the last few months. The Secretary General has, in various pledging conferences, which he's attended personally, whether in Rome or in New York, made a full court press for member states to come up with the critical funding that's needed. That has continued in various contacts that he's had with senior officials all over the world, in trying to get them to support the critical work of UNRWA, which the Secretary General has been a big supporter of. Mr. Cranbriel, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, has also been trying to work the phones. As you know, UNRWA took the very courageous decision of opening up the schools not long ago for those Palestinians who have a right to use their schools, but they do not have funding until the end of the year for work until the end of the year, and we're grateful to those donors who have stepped up. But UNRWA still faces a rather large financial shortfall.
The other thing that we're going to ask, the question that we're going to ask you was about the incarceration of the journalists by the Myanmar government, and the appeal of the Secretary General on calling upon them to release them, saying that the journalists have to be performing their duties. But is there any Secretary General representative or anybody else from the United Nations going to go and visit the authorities in Myanmar to see
the Secretary General's message has been echoed by the resident coordinator in Myanmar and all the other UN officials present there. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Stephane. Since it's been a long weekend, I have 3 questions.
One per day during the weekend you've come
yes,
up. That's
exactly.
Good. This is good.
Well, the first one is about a colleague of mine, a Rudao journalist, Omar Kalo, has been arrested by Syrian intelligence agents in Syria. I wonder if you have any comments or if you heard any reports about, from your colleagues, any chance about his whereabouts, because we don't know where he is now.
I have not, but I'd be happy to speak to you after the briefing.
And the second one is about Iran. According to Reuters, Iran had provided missile to Shiite proxies in Iraq. And the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, expressed concern. If this report is found to be true, is moving missile to neighboring countries a violation to 2231 according to your
I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. What we do know is that, and again, I have no independent confirmation of those reports. As a matter of principle, we do know that it's not an issue of bringing more weapons into Iraq. What we need is for the Iraqi political leaders to find consensus to build a new government, and we need reconstruction and reconciliation in Iraq. That's what Iraq is in need of. This
is about the Iran moving missiles into Iraq.
No, I understand. I understand. I'm just not. I can't address the hypothetical. Yes. What's the third question?
And the third one is about IDLEB. There are reports of shelling, bombing. Mm-hmm. According to United Nations assessment, has the operation already started, or do you have any information where?
Where we can our humanitarian colleagues have received reports of bombings and shelling in the area that I just mentioned, IDLEB and other areas. We're not in a position to say whether an official operation has started or not. We can only report on things as information that we get. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephane. Please allow me 2 questions on the Cyprus issue. The first one is, last week in an interview, the Foreign Minister of Turkey, Mr. Çavuşoğlu, he threatened Cyprus once again as regards the island's exclusive right to handle their economic zone. At the same time, he suggested an unofficial meeting between the parts to discuss under no conditions. This shows that Turkey does not consider Guterres' framework as the basis for a new round of negotiations. How does the Secretary General respond to that?
Look, I will leave the analysis of comments to analysts and journalists. As you know, consultations are underway to determine the future of the negotiations. So at this point, I'm not going to comment any further. Your second question?
Yes. Also last week, 238 Greek Cypriot members of the media, the huge majority, protested against the so-called glossary that reflects the personal views of 4 individuals, of which only one is a journalist. Among other international organizations, a protest letter was sent to the United Nations. How does the UN respond to that? Would you consider such glossary in the UN wording? Thank you.
I think my understanding is that this glossary concerns the work of the OSCE, so I would refer you to them. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Steph. I have 2 questions. First on Venezuela. Currently in Quito, Ecuador, there is a meeting by a group of at least 12 countries who are trying to find common ground on how to deal with the refugee crisis. So I wonder if they have reached out to the UN seeking for further cooperation, or if the UN has already had a role in these talks that are underway in Quito. And second, on Nicaragua, there is an NGO that today raised the number of people that have died during the time of unrest. Now there's 481 people that have died. So can you remind us which is the SG view on the fact that the death toll keeps climbing, and now especially that Nicaragua's government has kicked out the UN from the...
On your first question, I need to check if there was any UN involvement in those meetings. As far as Nicaragua is concerned, the Secretary General has always insisted on the need for full respect for the Nicaraguan people's human rights and the importance of a truly inclusive national dialogue. This was a message he's been delivering publicly and also privately when he met with the foreign minister of Nicaragua last week. As you know, as you mentioned, Nicaraguan authorities took the decision to PNG, our Human Rights Office colleagues, our 4 colleagues left Nicaragua on September 1st. They will continue to monitor the situation remotely as they're entitled to through their global mandate.
Thank you, Stephane. Do you have any update concerning the mediation effort in Libya announced for today by the UN mission in Tripoli?
No, I do not have any update on that. But let me see what I can get. Yes, sir.
Did the Secretary General discuss the Rohingyas crisis with the Chinese leaders, or did he press them to step their efforts to ease the Rohingya suffering in Myanmar?
I don't know if it particularly came up. I know the conversation focused on issues of trade and issues of Africa and China. Yes, ma'am.
Steph, do you have any details on the Kofi Annan memorial? I hear it's around the 22nd.
I believe it's that Friday, the Friday if it's 21st or 22nd, and I hope to have a bit more updates later today. I think some meetings taking place today to finalize it.
Was the Secretary General surprised by Jimmy Morales' decision to end CICIG in Guatemala?
Yes, the Secretary General was surprised. I think in the statement we issued over the weekend, I think for the Secretary General, he underscored the important contribution that CICIG has had in the fight against impunity in Guatemala under the leadership of the Commissioner.
Can I ask? So, will he try to get Morales to reinstate the commission or negotiate?
Well, I mean,
this?
the mandate ends in 1 year on September 3rd, 2019. So I have no doubt discussions will be had.
Thank you, Steve. I think I asked Coutinho was about update in Yemen in Geneva this September 6th.
Sorry?
How update in Geneva in Yemen?
Oh, Geneva. No, I have no updates. I mean, the discussions are. I think the schedule hasn't changed. Obviously, we have to wait for the discussions to get underway.
Thank you.
Nice suit, Yassine.
Thank you. I wasn't here. Anybody ask about a question? What's update in IDLEB? What's going on?
I started the briefing with that, so I can give you what I said later. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a follow-up on Yemen. I mean, we know that the Saudi Arabians coalition has apologized that they did that killing of the Yemeni children by mistake, and that, of course, they also admitted that, they didn't admit, but there were American bombs used. And the United States itself has said Saudi Arabia should be given a pass. Does the Secretary General have anything to say about this?
Look, we've seen the decision taken by the findings of the investigation that the coalition issued regarding those airstrikes on August 9th of this year, which, as you know, killed civilians and especially children. I think the pictures that we saw were heartbreaking, to say the least. I think we welcome the announcement by the coalition to enhance its rules of engagement on how to protect civilians, and stress the need for all parties to take effective measures to ensure accountability for past violations and to prevent potential future violations of international humanitarian law.
But the thing is, if you remember, like a year ago, it was determined that crime against humanity was being committed in the case of Yemen, especially in the killing of children. But that thing, they gave a pass to Saudi Arabia at that time.
Who gave a pass?
The previous administration of Mr.
I think I would refer you to the most recent report on children in armed conflict, which I think speaks for itself.
Stephane, do we have any update regarding the future of the negotiations regarding Cyprus?
No, I mean, the consultations are continuing. I think we have flagged Ms. Jane Hall-Lutz's discussions when they happen. When we have something to announce a bit more concrete, we shall. Yes, and then we'll go to Brendan.
Stora is holding another round of talks in Geneva right now, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Do you think this might lead to diffusing an attack on IDLEB, or that attack seems imminent and it's a big, more than 3 million civilians live in IDLEB?
Everything is connected one way or another. The talks that he's holding are follow-up on the constitutional committees, as he has described the upcoming talks as a moment of truth. I think Mr. de Mistura and Jan Egling, his advisor on humanitarian issues, I think gave a very impassioned briefing to the press a few hours ago. As you know, the situation is critical. The potential of major humanitarian catastrophe is very great. His appeal was for the Russian and the Turkish leaders to speak directly. His appeal was for all those who have influence on armed opposition groups in Syria, to use that influence in order to avoid fighting, to avoid civilians being used as human shields, to avoid civilians being targeted, to avoid civilians being in the crosshairs. We are on high alert. Our humanitarian colleagues are on high alert. Mr. de Mistura is working the phones in whatever way he can. But ultimately, the responsibility is to the parties who are involved in this conflict and all those who have influence of the parties who are involved in the conflict. The ultimate responsibility is on those who have a finger on the trigger to ensure that civilians are spared. Okay, Evelyn, then we will go to Brendan.
Yeah, in IDLEB, has there been any sign that chem weapons are being used? I know they've been warned not to do it.
We have no reports on that end. Mr. Varma, happy Tuesday.